story because I think folklore is a universal language because we have it. All cultures have these stories, and there's a universality to them. And um, they talk about deeper truths about human experience and human life.
All right. So, Joseph Bolton, you wrote a book called Old Grandmother's Tree. And I was curious, what do you do? What did you do for a living before you became an author?
Well, I grew up. I was born in Rhode Island. Grew up in Massachusetts. Then spent part of my childhood in New York. I did 25 years in the Army. I started off in the enlisted ranks. Went to West Point. I retired in 2007. I served in Afghanistan for a year in the Army. And my day job, because I'm still working on my day job, is I'm a project manager for the Air Force out at Hanscom Air Force Base. So I'm a civilian contractor for the Air Force. So I do that. That's my day job. And so I'm still doing that. And I look at it kind of pays for my real love, which is writing these series of books, Old Grandmother's Tree.
Hell yeah. That's thank you very much for your service, man. It means a lot to the rest of us who didn't serve. And to continue on that service after your service, that's pretty admirable, man. So what
Yeah.
made you write this book?
Well, I kind of I really started off very roots of this go back to my childhood. I was always very interested in my mother's family history. Her family's entirely from Quebec, French Canadian, and I used to hear stories about when they were young, they'd go visit family up in Quebec, go see the old family farm, visit the Saint Anne de Beaupré Shrine, Saint Joseph's Oratory in Montreal. And as I grew up, growing up, we would do family trips to Quebec. So I was always fascinated with that family history. And so about 10 years ago, I started researching my own family history. And part of that was researching building the trees on Ancestry. And the other part was giving a DNA test to my mother and five of her siblings. She's the oldest of 11. And one of the surprises that came out of that was that, we were told, my mother's family was told, we're 100% French. Well, the truth is they're mostly French, but they're actually have other nationalities. They're mostly French, but they also have Spanish or Basque and a little bit of English and also Native American. And although there were rumors of that in the background, we didn't really know for sure. But we found it, the DNA test. Science says, yeah, they have Native American ancestors. And I was able to find in Quebec, in Canada, four I call gateway Native American ancestors. And of those four, the most interesting was a young woman, Algonquin woman named Mitio Goku. And she lived in the 1600s, 1650s to 1699 in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. And her life, just by chance, happened to be very well documented by the Jesuit priests who lived in that area. And it was researched by another descendant of hers, named Norman Lavalle. And so I had all this information, I had a good picture of her life. And of all that writings about her, one of the things that really struck me also was um, a writing by the French priest named Father Elise Cray. He wrote this about her when she died in 1699, and he said, Mitio Goku lived a full life with dignity, respect, and love. A courageous and loving Algonquin woman. And I thought, wow, there's so much. It was almost like one of the most perfect eulogies ever written because it's only two lines, but it says so much about a person's life to say person lived a life, a full life, which means a life of activity, of interaction, a life with dignity and respect. That means you have standing within the community that you're in, and a loving and courageous person. Who would not want to have someone to say that about you when you pass away? And her story is is amazing, actually. So So imagine this. She's 22 years old. She's in Trois-Rivières in Quebec. She's married to another Algonquin man named Assababish, and she has two small children, and she's living a happy life right there in Trois-Rivières. Well, the Mohawks came up from New York and raided the settlement, and during that raid, her husband was killed, and her two small children were taken from her, and she never saw them again. Never heard anything about, doesn't know anything about what happened to them. So here she is at 22 and she loses everything. She lost her family. She lost her husband, lost her children, and she lost her children in a way where they're not totally gone, but she doesn't know what happened to them. He has no resolution. And I think that would be a tough thing for any young person at 22 to deal
Right.
with.
Yeah.
But instead of giving in despair, 5 years later, she married a French settler named Pierre Cauch, and together they became my ancestors. So I said, this is a fantastic story. And yet we also have this unique writing about her life from this priest, about how she lived a full life with dignity, respect, love, and courage. And so I took that as a starting point. I said, I'm going to tell the story about her life, at least the beginning part, and tie it in to this collection of stories called Old Grandmother's Tree. Um, Now, many people, it's very uncommon. It's very common for people who have notable ancestors to write stories or histories about them. And a lot of what they do is very realistic. They try to recreate exactly the time. But I did something different with this story. I took my ancestors, my Algonquin ancestors, my Quebec ancestors in the 1600s and right into the early, about 1903, where the story kind of ends. And I immersed them in a world, a reimagined Quebec of magic and folklore. So the characters, my ancestors, interact with trickster animal characters from Native American folklore, and so they're part of the story. And I like the language. I love folklore, and I've always loved folk tales. And I like using this as a language to tell their story because I think folklore is a universal language because we have it. All cultures have these stories, and there's a universality to them. And um, they talk about deeper truths about human experience and human life.
Right. And
And so
there's
it's a deeper
lots of
language.
allegories in there too, like in
Yes,
traditional
yes.
folk tales.
Right, right. So when a person reads, all these stories are original. I didn't really take any folk tales directly, but because I wrote them in the style of folktale, if you read the story, the books, the stories in them, you'll say, it sounds familiar. And it will, because it has that kind of folklore feel to it. And every story does have kind of a lesson. I don't hit you over the head with it in the story, but it's there. So the end state is we have this two-volume set of books, 40,000 words of text, over 450 full color illustrations by a wonderful artist named Natasha Pelly Smith out of Toronto. And so 10 stories, 450 illustrations, 40,000 words of text, and all the stories interrelated tell a much bigger story. So it's a very unique project, and it's very hard to categorize that.
So it's
But
like an old school folk tale book, like going back to the roots of folklore. Because like so when I'm reading a folklore book, it often, like you said, doesn't have that element of fantasy anymore like they used to. And the whole purpose of folk tales is to tell our heritage in a story so that future generations can remember those stories. I mean, that's the whole purpose of a folk tale. And so
absolutely.
I dig that, man. It's old school folk tales, and it's got a great story wrapped up into 10 little stories. So you can, as a matter of fact, if you've got young kids like I do, you can take, each week and read, you know, a story, and then over the course of, 10 days or whatever, um, you can unravel the entire, and see if those younger kids can get the underlying message there. I think that's fantastic, man. That's awesome. So Did you when did where did you learn of the your ancestors' history? Did you do a lot of research for the book, or did you already know this stuff?
Um, well, I knew it before I started the research, and specifically Mitio Goku as a person is because her life is very well documented. It just happened to work out that way. She was in the right place at the right time. The Jesuits maintained the records of who she married, the events of the attack, and I also think it was kind of unique that to have the Jesuit priest write that about her when she died. Not think about it, it was 1699, and for a priest to make a specific note of like that type about being a courageous, loving uh person with dignity and respect, write that about anyone, not common. Write that about a woman, even less so. Write that about a native woman of that time period. She had to really stand out. So, I felt really inspired by that. And as far as like the writing process, though, I would say is that it wasn't like I had this plan. Like, okay, I'm starting to write. It's going to be a 10 book, 10 story series, 2 volumes. It kind of developed over time. And every writer has a different way of going about creating the stories. I don't like have a planned time I sit down, I write. I let the stories develop within my mind. And for me, because I'm a very visual person, the stories unfold almost like a movie. I see the action at first, and I kind of set the stage for my characters in the story and let that develop. And when it kind of reaches a point of culmination, like where I just like a dam, I just can't contain anymore. Then I sit down and I write it all at once for a first draft, just all at once. Could be anytime, could be the middle of the night, could be first thing in the morning. But when I'm ready to write, I write. So I can't do it on demand. It has to come within, and it just comes out. And but the stories kind of naturally link themselves, and I think that talks a lot about the mystery of the creative process. The stories are linked. They kind of refer to each other. They have like premonitions about something else going to happen in a story. And they were things that I put in, and the artists also put in sometimes the illustrations that neither of us at a conscious level were aware of. So that's how that conscious mind, it all kind of came together. And when you talked about reading a story, it's a great book for parents and grandparents to read their children. And you don't have to feel that you have to start at story one, volume one. The stories are written in a way that each story can stand on its own. They can
Yeah.
stand on its own, and you can read them in any order that you want. And but as you read them, a fuller picture, like a mosaic, like putting a piece of glass on that mosaic, and you're creating a bigger picture. It all comes together, and it doesn't matter what order you read the stories in, but the whole picture will start to come together as you read more and more.
Yeah, man. So that's really amazing because they don't. I it's very rare to see books written like that anymore. I used to read books like that all the time when I was a kid. And did you have like a throwback moment where you were like, "Man, I see these books on the shelves, but they're not like standalone folk tales where you can just pick up, a place in the middle of the book and start there." Did you did you read a lot of folklore when you were a kid?
Oh, absolutely. I loved Greek mythology and Roman mythology, and then into to Norse mythology. And then as a child, they kind of focus on those because that was available to you. But I also have read Japanese mythology, Chinese mythology, and um, one thing that always struck me as an adult when I look back on that and I look at the whole body of mythological works throughout the world, that there is a universality. They talk about values, they talk about lessons, they talk about deep respect. And we're talking about stories sometimes go back, roots of which go back 2,000 years or even longer for many of them. So it really is a deep language. And
Yeah.
so that became because I really wanted to talk about, I didn't want to retell the story of Mitio Goku and her life, her tragic, but her triumph. I didn't want to tell it as a dry retelling of facts. I wanted to use the lens of a folktale style storytelling to really get the feel about how she felt at that time. And I think the folklore language is very unique, suited for that purpose.
Hell yeah, man. That's that's amazing. Because when I was younger, there used to be like Aesop's fables, and there used to be these books that they're comprised of many different stories that all kind of tied together as one. And as an adult, I'm into that, you know, but I very rarely see that, and it's really great for
Hmm.
me to run into a book like that and read it to my kids because it's broken down into digestible pieces for them where it's not too long for me to read at the end of every night, you know, and it's not
Hmm.
too long for them to digest, and it's just like the perfect size. But over the course of the whole book, they do get a lesson. And it talks, you know, you can pass through stories of values, like you said, and family histories and cultural history, all in these stories, and it's wrapped up as entertainment to like kids and
Hmm.
adults alike. But you really are learning something in the process, and you are taking on not taking on the values, but you're learning about the values of the author. At the same time, you're learning the stories, and it's kind of it's very personal and it's awesome. I love that kind of stuff. Is there so you said there's Native American characters, animal characters in your book. Did you base those off any particular real people or?
Um, well, I based, well, some of them I created based on names from Micmac, which is a tribal community based in Nova Scotia. So they already had characters like animals and they had names associated. For example, Mewan the bear, that's one of the characters in the book. One of the most important one is a turtle named Uncle McKeish. And yeah, he's a good example of how the process I went through. So there's Uncle McKeish. And if you read the original Micmac stories, and I have a copy of it on my bookshelf, and I read through that, Uncle McKeish is kind of a bumbling, comical, old uncle character who always gets into trouble. And so I kind of started with that, but really the character of Uncle McKeish I wrote in my book, he's a turtle. He's a very wise old turtle, but sometimes he still gets a little bit of grumpy. So he grumpiness, or he has has a sense of like insecurity, even though he's very old and very wise. And so they're very developed characters, but their personalities are very much what I gave them. They're not really tied directly into the personalities of the old mythology. And then, so that was like kind of the junior. There's two kinds of trickster characters I have in the book. I have the junior trickster characters, which include a bear named Mewan, a raccoon named Azaban, a moose named Poku. Um,
I
you know,
love it, man. I
and
love it.
yeah, and then I have senior trick character, elder being characters I called them, and they're entirely all made up by me. One's a polar bear. I got a polar bear. I got an orca. I got an eagle, a snowy owl, and I gave them names based on Ojibwe mythology, even though they're totally new characters. And I used Ojibwe because the artist Natasha is actually of Ojibwe and Cree. And so I did that kind of a way of honoring her heritage as well.
That's awesome. You know, you had mentioned the Micmac Indians, and ironically, when I was a kid, I learned about the Micmac Indians through a folktale.
Hmm.
You know the book, of course, you know Stephen King.
Yes.
The book Pet Cemetery.
Yes.
Well, that when that was adapted into a movie, I was a real little kid and I loved Stephen King books. I know pretty weird for a young kid, but I loved Stephen King books and I was introduced to the Micmac Indian tribe through
Hmm.
those stories and reading the books and watching the movies. I had there was a certain curiosity there. I was like, well, Micmac Indian tribe, but I've never heard of those.
Hmm.
So I looked up information. I sought out, I researched essentially, and just out of curiosity. That's very awesome that because I ironically did learn from a folktale about the Micmac Indian tribe. Is
Yeah.
that part of the reason why you decided to tell this story in a folklore format?
I think definitely, definitely. The four I call gateway ancestors because I don't say I have four Native American ancestors every because let's say Miteo Goku. Well, if somebody asks, well, how many Algonquin ancestors you have? I said I have untold thousands because all of Miteo Goku's ancestors are also mine, right? So that's why I used the word gateway. So for Micmac, I had two Micmac women as gateway ancestors, but I didn't know very much about them, but I wanted also honor them by telling Miteo Goku's story in a sense, okay, I'm letting her stand in for all those ancestors of that time period because I don't know the story of the two Micmac women that I have as gateway ancestors. And the other mentioned four, so the other one is kind of an interesting person. His name is Matic He was a Penobscot in in Maine. He was a warrior, and he was very closely allied with a very eccentric French baron named Baron Jean Vincent de Castine. And the baron himself, actually led the Penobscot tribe for a brief period of time, and he married Matacawando's daughter. So the Baron and Matacawando's daughter, they became my ancestors, but they have a very fascinating story too. But it's very different from it didn't have the same kind of level of romance for me, or it didn't touch me the same way I think as Smidio Goku's. But in a sense, by using Native American folktale based characters that are based on that, you can always call it like fan fiction folktale based on that because it's my
Right.
interpretation, but it's my way of honoring all of them and honoring that part of my heritage, as well as the French Canadian ancestors I have in the books as well. So by telling a story, this is my way of honoring them and telling a much deeper connection about them.
Do you feel closer to them?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I really feel that as I developed the characters of the personality or brought forth the personality of Mitio Goku and her husband, first husband, Babish, I had a real sense that they were kind of directing me um, how they wanted to be portrayed. I can't really explain how that works
Yeah,
or how true it is, but I
I
can tell you
totally
that's the
get that.
effect.
I totally get that because like the same thing has happened to me before. Like not necessarily like with writing or anything like that, but there are some times where I feel guided by, like my mother who's no longer here. Sometimes I feel guided by her sometimes, and my grandfather, people that I've known in the past that I'm no longer talking to, stuff like that. I totally
Hmm.
get that connection that it's connected to the drive somehow. It's like you want to go that direction, and then there's this voice over here. It's not like a nagging voice. You can barely hear it. You have to really pay
Very
attention to
much.
get it. But once you tune into that, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what we're doing now. Yeah, I totally get that.
Right. Even Natasha, as the artist, would feel that sometimes that, her, especially when we were doing the portions of the story that dealt with Native Americans, Natasha herself felt like she was channeling inspiration from her own Cree and Ojibwe ancestors as well.
So do you get do you so it's kind of like Indian folklore, Native American folklore. Those tales are meant to bring us back and tell those heritage tales, and so we don't forget our history and our ancestry.
Hmm.
Did you have a sense of like nostalgia at reading over this stuff and thinking about what life was like back then?
I I don't really think nostalgia may be the correct
Maybe,
word.
yeah, maybe
I
that's the wrong
think
word.
I felt the connection because when I look back on that, life back then was hard.
Yes.
it was very difficult, and there was a level of great uncertainty, and just in Mitio
Especially up
Goku's
north.
life,
Especially
yeah,
up north. That's it was very cold up there.
it was not only cold, but it was also a time of conflict. You had the French encroaching on the Native American territories, and although it wasn't necessarily a conquest in the way we normally would think of it, it was definitely an encroachment on the French, and that created tension. And then you had the Mohawks, Iroquois, the five Iroquois tribes, especially the Mohawks, would come up and raid into the north. You always had uncertainty because that could happen anytime. You don't know when that's going to happen. So I think it's not a time that that the early 1600s that I would want to live in, but I did like talking about, writing about it, recreating it so people can understand what it was like being to live in that time period. And we did a lot of research when we created these illustrations. One of the things we did was very important to us is, well, how did the Algonquins up in Quebec live in that time period? They didn't live in teepees; they lived in longhouses. How did they dress? They didn't dress like the Plains Indians you see like in typical Hollywood. So we really went through a lot of effort to be authentic, and and we used as many characters as we could. Many of the characters we could, as we based them on real people and historical records that actually lived up in Trois-Rivières. So a lot of research went into creating this. So when you read the books, even though that does have a little bit of magic and a little bit of like Native American folk tales, there's a lot of that is very authentic as much as we could to put that in there to make you feel like you're there.
That's that I mean that's just storytelling 101, right? That's
Yes.
my favorite kind of author who wants to take us there. You know, because I have an amazing mind's eye, and as I'm reading stories, like it's kind of like a movie. I can separate the book from the internal visions, I guess, like my mind's eye. I can separate those two and really enjoy what I'm reading through
Hmm.
great storytelling. That is awesome. Did you
Well,
it's Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that this process is ongoing. I have another
That's
book called The
that's
Dance of.
actually my next question.
Oh,
I was going to
okay.
ask.
Is it we connect? That's because we have a good connection right here, right now. We're
Right?
talking same wavelength.
That's
So
where I was going.
yes, so I have a process of three different books, but they're all part of the same old grandmother's tree universe. And so the next story I'm writing is called The Dance of Creation. And in the story, it's both the book is actually a prequel and a sequel. So it is a prequel in the sense that it talks about the creation of the world. And I created my own mythology, but it's very much a Native American inspired mythology. And the illustrations for it are stunning that Natasha did. But it's up the creation of the world. Where did these trickster animal characters come from? And it talks about where they came from. But the framing story is set 100 years in the future. And there's an Algonquin grandfather who's sitting around a campfire with his grandchildren, just taking them on a camping trip out in Pembroke, Ontario, Canada. And I did that for a couple of reasons because um, I've made, as part of this book, I've made great contacts with the Algonquin community in Pembroke, Ontario, which is west of kind of northwest of Ottawa. And there are some of the Mitio Goku descendants who live there. So I made great connections with them. So to honor them, I said, I'm going to set this with Algonquin grandfather from your community 100 years from now, telling the story about the creation of the world to his grandkids around a campfire.
That's
And
awesome.
and I said it 100 years from now deliberately because I wanted the reader to look at this and say, and understand that the story is ongoing now. It's not something that's in the past. The stories surround you in the future and in the past. You are immersed in the story. So that's why the framing part, the grandfather telling the story, hasn't really occurred yet in our time, but it will occur. but we're part of that universe. We're immersed inside. So it's like if you were inside a 360-degree theater, is the way I look at it. You see the past of these stories going back to the 1600s or even the creation of the world. On the other hand, you see 100 years from now, you see a grandfather who I wrote as a descendant of Mitio Goku, telling the stories, passing on that story, the mythology to his grandchildren, that art of storytelling. So I'm very excited about that. That book it's written. All the rough sketches are done. Natasha is in a couple of weeks going to start doing the final illustrations. That should come out in um, perhaps August. And I'm going to drive it up myself personally up to Pembroke and give it to the community, Algonquin community leaders. And look what I got. And you talk about other goals I have for you talk about movies and stuff for this book. I have a lot of very ambitious goals for this whole book series. For this particular book, Dance of Creation, I really want to have it translated into Algonquin,
Oh, yes. Yes, that would
but
be so special.
and it can be done. Algonquin is an endangered language. It's not extinct yet, but it's definitely endangered. And I think to support any kind of language like it, you need something to read. You need something for people to really want to use. If you're going to learn Algonquin, you want to be able to use it. So I really want to do it, but it's very expensive. So I'm looking for grants. I'm looking to pay for help pay for that process. All the books, though, are translated into French as well, of course, because it is Quebec. And the other goal I have is I would love this. I really do think that this would make a great like miniseries on Netflix, either animated or live
Yes.
action, because there's enough stories there, there's enough divination. And there was another gentleman I did a podcast with about a week ago, and he has a friend who's a producer in Montreal. So he's going to pass on the website to him and the information about the books. You never know. But I do believe that this book series would make an awesome series like on Netflix or Amazon or Apple or something like that.
Uh,
So,
that's awesome. So is the illustration behind you your background? Is that from the book?
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
That's
Yeah, I wish
awesome.
you could see the whole thing, but there you can. I don't know if you can see, there's a
Yeah, I
character
can
right
see.
there. Okay, you can see a character. He's kind of a ghost. He's a ghost of
Okay.
Asababish. And he visits Mitio Goku on her wedding night to Pierre Kauk and basically kind of tells her, you can't be looking in the past. Says, and he says to her, because she says to his ghost, I've married again. It's Pierre. And of course, Pierre and Asababish knew each other. She was almost apologetic to it a little bit, to Asababish, his ghost. And he said, oh, I'm so happy for you because I'm happy that you're not going to be alone. That's what's concerned. So anyway, that's part of the story. He's giving her a parting gift, and that gift is he's reaching down. I don't know if you can see it, but he's reaching down. He's grabbing the Northern Lights with one hand,
Yeah.
and the other hand he's taking it and he's throwing it onto this shawl that she's wearing.
Okay. Now, yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
And so that shawl, that's an interesting part of the story too. The shawl is something, it was originally gray and it was given to her by Pierre as a wedding gift. Well, when she meets late at night, she walks out into the woods by herself. She encounters the trickster animal characters. She encounters the spirit of her former husband, or her first husband, and he gives her kind of like the northern lights. He infuses it into the shawl, and the shawl always have the colors of the northern light. And that Shaw is featured in stories hundreds of years later with her descendants, my great great grandparents. She's wearing that same shawl, and that's a symbol of the shawl is kind of a physical symbol of that connection we have with our ancestors, that part of them resides within us. And the shawl represents that physical connection, that spiritual connection, that that connection of beliefs that we have with our ancestors that they passed on to us. And so that's what I love this illustration. And I'm sorry you have my head kind of in the
Oh,
way and
no
you can only
worries,
see it.
man.
But, but
No
this is,
worries. You got some great illustrations up on your website too. And like
yes,
Natasha did a great job.
she
A
did.
great,
She
an
did.
amazing job. This art is so wonderful. And just looking at the pictures, you could almost get the story just from the illustrations alone. And I love every bit of that, man. I was this a passion project for you, or did you start this with the intention of making something big?
It started off as a passion project. I think that I think if you anyone start off as I did, I'm going to make this book series and it's going to make a lot of money, you're probably going to fail. You're going to get frustrated. But I did this because I believe in the work. I believe in the message of the stories themselves. And I'm 61. At this point in my life, I wanted to be able to leave something of myself behind after I'm gone that I can be proud of. It's my legacy. And so this is definitely a passion project. Um, I'd love to see it become, like I said, a Netflix series or an anime series, not because it would bring me monetary gain, but
But to share
because
it with the world. Yeah.
share
Yeah.
this because I think this is a story that talks about family love, family connections, about treating each other with dignity and respect. Um, you know, it's an entertaining story, but it's a story that's appropriate for families, and we need that now. And
Oh yeah.
so that's how it started. Definitely a passion project, but I love sharing it, and I'd love to see it shown throughout the world. I mean, Natasha's illustrations are so good that you look at it, think the animated story, you can see how it could all come together. It's very Disney-esque, I think, if
I
you look at all of them.
I agree. I very much agree with that because I was thinking Disney before you said that, like probably 5 minutes ago. I was thinking, ah, man, this would be a perfect project for Disney. I was I was thinking that. That's amazing. So do you have any other projects? Like I know you said you got a project coming up that you're working in relation to this book. Do you have any projects planned or any thoughts about continuing your storytelling outside of this particular story?
Not outside the story right now. I think this is pretty well focused. Like I said, I have three books. So I have this one come out in August. I have another one called All Around You, There's Light, and it's going to be an epic story. And it's about Mitio Goku recounting the attack, the events of the attack, and other aspects of her life to her granddaughter just before she died. That's going to come out next year. And then I have another story, which will be kind of an adventure story with the LaRue girls, who are characters in the second book, as they travel across Canada by train on the way to Whitehorse. So it's going to have train robbing bandits, cowboys, trickster animal characters, all kind of stuff. So that right now has my total focus.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah,
I live in St. Joseph,
hmm
Missouri, and that's where Jesse James was shot and killed.
yeah,
So there's another connection there, train robberies, and I
yes.
really love trains. I love everything
Oh,
about
I do
trains. I
too.
love old trains. I love new trains. So that's amazing, man. Do you
So
have any kids?
I have two adult daughters. I don't have any grandchildren. Um, One daughter's married, but no grandchildren. And but I do have numerous nephews and nieces that I have very, good relations with. I have a couple of grandnieces and nephews as well. And speaking of my nephews, and my nieces, the adult ones, the ones that are about 30 years old. There's a chapter in my second book um, where Uncle McKeish is riding the back of his nephew, Poku the Moose, and they're going back to Mount Orford. And they're having this conversation. And McKeish is feeling as an older being, he's feeling kind of inadequate. And, and his nephew is kind of brushing it off and finally says, Uncle, you're the best uncle that I ever have. I love your stories, even if you do repeat them. And and you know and I love you, and I really shortened it, but the chapter is really great. It's called the Walk to Mount Orford, and I really modeled that on my relationships with my own nephews and nieces, and also my elder uncles and aunts who are still like in their 80s now. And So, one aspect of some parts of the story, the dialogue, I'm the nephew talking to my older nephews and the older uncle. And other part, I'm the Uncle McKeish, the old uncle, a little grumpy maybe, talking to his younger nephew and niece. And so it just illustrates how I put my own self, my own experience, and the relationships about these characters. And I think one way this story is probably different from a folklore style is that sometimes folklore story, the characters, they don't have a lot of depth or development. And or trickster animal characters from mythology, they're very one-dimensional. They have this power or they have this focus. This is what they do. But in these stories, even the trickster animal characters, they have their emotions, they have their weaknesses, their insecurities sometimes, even though they're powerful. They have their relationship as a family of trickster animal characters. And so I've tried to give all the characters a kind of depth to them so you can identify with them. So in that way, it's a little bit, maybe a little different from a traditional folktale.
That's beautiful, man. That's it's so funny because like so I talk to I often talk to my family members through the podcast. I'll be
Hmm.
talking to somebody and I'll be going through something, or a family member will be going through something, and I'll have a guest on the podcast and we'll be talking, and it'll be completely unrelated. And I'll just have a thought and I'll include that in there and I'll be like, oh, well, you should listen to this week's podcast because I was actually talking about that very
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
And I have those communications subtly with my family members through the podcast, the ones who listen. I'm like, hey, listen, I was actually talking to you. That's our communication, like
Hmm.
that's how I relay. I understand what you're going through. And when I don't understand what you're going through, I'll have a guest on the show and we'll talk about it. And that's how I learn things. And that's very, very beautiful that you do that through your storytelling as well. That's awesome.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you have any plans on um so I've already asked that question. Do you have any plans on writing any further books? Do you have any plans on writing like short stories or anything like that? Because
Um,
I got to tell you, I can tell very much. I haven't even read the book, and I can tell very much that you're a great storyteller.
yes, I've always had an imagination. Um, but I have written a couple of horror stories, short stories, which is totally out of type for me. But I do belong to like a writers group at the local library. So one of the challenges we had was during Halloween, we gather it up together and we have to write a horror story and then we pass it around and we have to guess among ourselves who wrote what story. And so I wrote a horror story called The Door at the Top of the Stairs, and it deals with um, an adult woman who harmed her. Um, she was
Hey,
like
you could talk
she had a
freely
big
here.
event.
There's no editing
Okay,
on this, so you could talk
okay.
freely.
Well, in the story, she had some kind of incident that happened in a store where she just kind of lost it, and so she's in a psychiatric ward now, and she's starting to recount a dream that she has, and she has this dream that she goes to the top of the stairs. And as she gets closer to the door at the top of the stairs, she's just filled with abject terror and she can't open the door. She doesn't know what's going on. So she goes to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist talks to, does hypnotism, and she recounts the dream and she forces her to go through and open that door. Well, it turns out there was an incident. And she opens the door and she goes in and there's toys. It's like an old attic. It's dark. It's creepy. It's got that one um, old-fashioned iridescent light that's illuminating and the kind of light rocks back and forth and the shadows create in the background. And her little brother, she was only like five, maybe her brother was like a year younger than her, was there. And she recounts how a monster came out of the wall, opened the door in the attic, and pulled her brother in. But the way I wrote the story is the way she recounted, you don't really know if the door was open and she pushed her brother in or there really was a monster. So anyway, that's the story I wrote. So that's my imagination going.
See, and as you're telling that, I'm like, what's happening next? What's happening next? That's
No, it's a
that's
very creepy
amazing.
story, a very creepy story.
You should
But
you
yeah.
should absolutely publish that, man. I that like if like let's just say, a couple years from now, you got nothing going on, but you're still, sales are going good on the book or whatever, you got things moving around, but you have a website. You can
Mhm.
you can publish that on the website as like a short story. And like you are really good at telling stories. I was intently listening to that. That's
Oh, good.
amazing.
It is. It was a fun story to write, but it's definitely creepy. And I left a lot out just for sake of time. But it's called the door at the top of the stairs. And you're right. Maybe I could. Maybe there are anthology websites for horror anthology submissions. My daughter likes to write horror stories. That's her specialty. Um, but I've written that. I do. You did mention another project. There was another project that was kind of set aside that I started like 5 years ago, where I actually took a couple of characters that I created in ancient Greek time mythology, and they're dealing with ancient Greek gods, other Greek
Yes.
characters. And it's actually, if you go to my blog site, there's some excerpts of that site. My blog is Augustine's Alley, and I do a lot of writing on there too. And I've written more like philosophy, science, and mathematics. But on that website, um, it's called Phidias and Tecton. And so what it is, actually started writing that before I started to the old grandmother's tree. And and I actually said, I'm going to set that aside. I had this idea for this French Canadian story. I'm going to write it and then go back to Phidias and Tecton. It was 5 years ago. I haven't gone back to it yet. But Phidias is he's a like an ancient Greek philosopher, builder, scientist like Archimedes, and he's got as an apprentice, he's got a young centaur as named Tecton, and they have adventures in ancient Greece, especially dealing with mathematics. And I wrote it a way where the stories actually teach mathematical principles, but they encapsulate it in kind of a madcap kind of adventures that Phidias and Tecton have. So that story isn't published. It's not even finished, but I have some great ideas on that. But if you went to the website and you did Phidias and Tecton, it's on the Augustine's Alley website. Yeah, which is totally separate from my old grandmother's tree.
That's
So, but
that's
that's another project. Eventually, maybe I'll get to that too, I guess. So,
yeah, because totally into. I dig it. So we've been on here for a while now, and I wanted to ask you one more question before I
mhm,
let you go. Are
sure.
you a history buff? And if you are, how did that kind of fit into writing?
Oh, definitely a history buff. I love probably my favorite is Roman history and Roman society. It doesn't necessarily, I think a love of history ties in with my desire to go to the past and write these stories about old Quebec in the 1600s and the early 1900s. But as far as my favorite is actually um, old Roman history. And my favorite book to read, and I highly recommend to anyone, is Plutarch's Lives of Noble Romans and Greeks. And in it, and maybe this is a way that kind of inspired me a little bit because in the book, uh, um, Plutarch wrote, he started collecting these stories um, of noble Romans and Greeks and their history, and he started writing it for somebody else. But about fourth story in, biography in, he says, I started writing this for so and so, but I really have learned a lot about the vices and virtues of these men are inspiring to me how I lived my life. And he wrote it for himself. So I think that aspect, that approach to history, that we're using history to learn about ourselves now, kind of inspired me as well. And so that is a book I would recommend for anyone to read. It sounds kind of dry, but no, it's very dramatic. Plutarch's Lives of Noble Romans and Greeks, or Greeks and Romans. But
Yeah, I'm totally into the Greek mythology stuff, man. It's
mhm.
I've been into like since I was a real little kid. So that's awesome, man. I that's this has been a great conversation, Joseph. I
Oh, it's
really
been fun.
appreciate you coming and hanging out with me. I think this would be a good place to leave this conversation.
Sure.
I'd love to have you back on when you complete another project. You want to have? I think you had a project manager that had reached out to me in the beginning. Um,
Yes.
let's do this again, man.
Oh, absolutely. When my next book comes out in August, I'd be happy to do that. And if you'd like, I'd be happy to send you copies of Old Grandmother's Tree for yourself to read.
I would love that. I
Just
would love that.
send me a mailing address. I'd be happy to get them on the way to you.
Awesome. I will when we hop off here, I'll send my address to Steph and is it Steph? I think
Steph,
it's Steph. Yeah. So I'll send all my information to Steph and we'll get that going. And next
sure.
time when you release that book, we'll have you on again. This has been a great, amazing conversation. And the name of the book is Old Grandmother's Tree. And you guys can pick that up at oldgrandmotherstree.com. Where else can people find you?
It's on Amazon.
Okay.
I'm also available at some bookstores Rhode Island and Central Massachusetts. Libraries also in Massachusetts, and I actually have it for sale um, at the St. Catering Shrine at the Mohawk Reservation in Quebec, just south of Montreal.
That's
So
awesome.
internationally, available internationally. Yes.
That's amazing. Joseph Bolton, author of Old Grandmother's Tree. Thank you for coming and hanging out with us. Until next time, we'll see you.